Beneath drifting deserts, under dark oceans, and in the silent stars above us, traces of brilliance flicker and fade. Cities that once hummed with trade and light have turned to dust. Libraries that gathered all known wisdom vanished in a single blaze. Signals that may have crossed space burned out before we could listen. Yet we keep searching, scanning the skies for life, digging through lost ruins, tracing ancient footsteps in our own DNA. Why do so many worlds seem to bloom and then go dark just before we arrive? Are we late to the great conversation of the universe? Or are we among the first to survive long enough to speak? Join us as we travel through forgotten empires, drowned machines, cosmic silence, and the fragile beauty of human endurance. Asking the question that shadows every explorer's heart, do advanced civilizations always disappear before we can find them? It begins quietly, with a single question that has lived in the back of human thought for as long as there have been fires to stare into, and skies to measure with bare eyes. If there are other minds out there, other hands building and breaking and reaching upward, why do we find only silence? Imagine standing in the cool night air of an empty steppe somewhere in Central Asia. No buildings for miles. Only the faint shape of stones half buried in grass, and the wind dragging loose sand across carvings whose meanings have been lost. Somewhere in the distance, a river once carried trade and song, and the busy talk of merchants. But it has long since dried and left behind just a shallow line cutting across the plain. This is how most searches begin, not with discovery, but with absence so wide you feel it before you know what it means. Every age of explorers has followed this same path. The Greek historian Herodotus walked among the shattered temples of Egypt and asked local priests about the kings whose names were half remembered. 17th century travelers rode into Mesopotamia and found walls of Nineveh rising from the dust like the spine of a buried beast, carved reliefs of kings and lions, half exposed to the sky, and wondered how a place once alive with scribes and soldiers could be so quiet now. Even in the modern age, when satellites draw maps from orbit and ships can cross any sea, the silence remains. Beneath the stars there are still oceans without lights, deserts where once there were roads, and coastlines that have swallowed harbors whole. It is in these places that the question grows heavier. If civilizations can rise to such size and then vanish without even leaving their names intact, what chance do we have of finding worlds far beyond ours before they too are gone? It is easy to think of lost neighbors in space when you stand at the edge of an ancient ruin. At night the wind carries nothing but the hiss of sand and the faint calls of night animals. No torches burn, no smoke from hearths curls into the air, and yet once there were cities. Somewhere underfoot there are potsherds and bone needles. Bits of copper, fragments of a life lived so long ago, it now belongs only to the earth. The oceans hold their own silences. Divers off the coast of Egypt swim through the flooded streets of Thaunis Heracleion, a port city that ruled trade before the time of Alexander and then slipped beneath the sea after earthquakes and waves broke its foundations. They light their way with electric beams that cut through the dark water and touch on fallen columns, bronze statues of forgotten gods, and coins that once passed between sailors from Greece and Nubia. When these things were whole, they were the living edge of a trading world. Now they are tombstones and silt. The same waters have taken pieces of Alexandria, Carthage, and ports along the Black Sea. The sea is wide enough to swallow memory. On land, deserts have done the same work. The Taklamakan in western China is said to eat men whole, and somewhere under its dunes are the remains of cities that guided the Silk Road, rich with lacquered chests and bright murals of riders and kings. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu uncovered the sealed caves of Dunhuang, filled with scrolls and paintings untouched for centuries. 1,000 years of belief and art sat in the dark, while the caravans that once stopped there vanished like a spoken word into the wind. Even with modern instruments, our time outpaces us. The telescopes at Arecibo in Green Bank have spent decades listening to the black distance for voices. Once, in 1977, a narrow spike of radio energy, the WOW signal whispered from Sagittarius, and then never came again. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was someone. But if it was someone, they are already gone or quiet. Light takes time, and so do civilizations. A voice we hear now could belong to a city already crumbled, a planet already cold. These scattered scenes, an empty riverbed, coins in the sea, scrolls in sealed caves, a brief radio cry across the galaxy are the preface to the larger search. They remind us that time is not gentle and distance is not forgiving. We look into the dark not because we think survival is common, but because survival is rare and beautiful, and we hope to witness it. The ruins under our feet are both warning and invitation. Others built, others dreamed, others reached. Some fell silent before anyone came to visit. Some might have waited for us and failed. And so, before any grand theory or cosmic calculation, there is this, the human standing alone, ears open, looking up, looking down, aware that everything that lives leaves traces, but not always enough. The ruins teach patience, but also urgency. They say, search while you can, listen while there is time, because the night is long and silence comes quickly. There are places in the world where the wind drags across the ground with a low sigh, lifting grains of sand into slow-moving veils that hide and reveal the edges of something that once was alive. And if you stand there long enough, you may notice faint outlines of walls, a line of mud brick darker than the pale dust around it, or the tip of a carved column that has been waiting centuries to see the sun again. In southern Iraq, near the winding Tigris and Euphrates, lies the buried heart of Uruk, one of the first cities ever built by human hands, where around 3200 BCE men and women raised ziggurats to the sky and pressed the first known, writing into wet clay tablets that dried to the color of bone. It was once crowded with markets, potters, scribes, and priests who moved under the heat of a Mesopotamian sun. And yet by the time European travelers stumbled across it in the 19th century, it was little more than mounds of earth broken here and there by the sharp angle of ancient brick. Uruk is not alone. Across the sands of Egypt lies Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, a city built in a rush by Pharaoh Akhenaten around 1346 BCE. It was a daring break from the old gods and the power of entrenched priests. He filled it with grand open plazas, sun-drenched temples, and wide streets meant to glorify a single god of light, and for 17 brief years it thrived. But Akhenaten died, his city fell from favor, and the desert began its patient work. When archaeologists Flinders, Petrie, and others came upon it thousands of years later, they found streets swallowed in dunes, half-standing houses where wind had carved doorways into strange shapes, and shattered statues of the royal family with their strange elongated features staring at nothing. These cities were not meant to vanish. Uruk's scribes believed their clay tablets would outlast kings. Akhenaten's builders raised stone to speak of eternity. Yet time is not impressed by ambition. Trade routes shifted, rivers changed course, and small failures compounded until marketplaces fell silent and the walls crumbled. Sand arrived slowly at first, carried grain by grain, then rolled into waves that covered gardens, painted floors, and once bright doorways. The people left or died, and the wind took everything that could not hold fast. When explorers first returned to these forgotten places, the experience was part wonder and part sorrow. In 1850, Austin Henry Layard rode through the Mesopotamian desert with local guides and saw what he thought were natural hills. But when he and his workers dug into them, they found carved reliefs of kings with curled beards, winged bulls, and battle scenes still sharp after 2,500 years. These discoveries felt almost like theft, the living waking a sleeper. In Amarna, the modern name for Akhenaten, travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries described whole doorways leading to sand-choked rooms and fragments of painted limestone still showing, scenes of the royal family worshipping the Aten in pale blues and golds. Even the ruins could not hold their stories completely. Many names were lost or broken. Whole languages lay silent until scholars like Henry Rawlinson began piecing together. Cuneiform signs in the 1800s, climbing cliffs at Beaston in present day. You ran to copy trilingual inscriptions that finally opened the locked speech of Sumer and Akkad. Without that, Uruk might have remained only a ghostly mound with no voice. In Egypt, the strange revolution of Akhenaten had to be rebuilt from fragments. The memory of his sun god almost erased by later pharaohs, who chiseled out his name and faces. It is easy to believe that memory is strong. But here, in these deserts, memory seems weaker than wind. A single failed harvest, a lost battle. A river turning aside can break the back of a city. And after a few lifetimes, the very stones can appear as part of the land rather than something shaped by human will. The sand erases, but it also preserves in its own way. Because of that slow burial, we still hold in our hands tablets from Uruk with accounts of barley and beer, and painted plaster from Akhenaten where you can still see the hands of a craftsman, brushing yellow onto a sunbeam, standing in such places today. Whether on the flat plain of Warka, as Uruk is now called, or among the crumbling palaces of Amarna, you feel the span of time stretch and blur. You know that thousands of feet once walked the same ground and believed they were building forever. Yet now, only the faint whistle of the wind and the rasp of sand across stone remains. You might imagine those first explorers brushing away grit to find an eye staring up from a carved relief.
Ow!
Or the outline of a city gate emerging where there was only emptiness. And you may wonder what of us will stand when our names have been forgotten. These cities under sand remind us that greatness does not guarantee survival, and that discovery often arrives too late to meet the makers. The fragility of memory is not an idea, but a fact carried in every broken statue and every tablet dug from clay. Each one is a whisper across thousands of years, saying that we are not immune to silence. Somewhere now, another city is emptying. Somewhere, the first grains are blowing against its doors. There are places along the Mediterranean where the water seems to hold its breath, as though aware that it covers more than just sand and stone. It covers memory itself. Once, on these same coasts, ships moved in steady processions. Sails white against the blue horizon, their hulls heavy with grain, papyrus, glass, and gold. Men hauled ropes and called out to one another in tongues now lost, guiding vessels toward towering breakwaters and busy docks, where merchants bargained and travelers stepped ashore. Today, divers swim where traders once walked, and their light falls across pillars toppled onto the seafloor. Across amphorae lined like patient soldiers in the sand, across statues whose faces, once gazing at the harbor mouth, now look blankly into green water. Few places speak more clearly of this quiet drowning than the vanished port city of Thanessara clan. In the delta of the Nile, where the river loosens into many arms before giving itself to the sea, there was once a thriving gate between Egypt and the wider Mediterranean world. Ancient texts spoke of it, Heracleion to the Greeks, Thonis to the Egyptians, but for centuries it was nothing more than rumor and old stories, till at the dawn of the 21st century, a team led by Frank Godeo found it again. Lying under 30 feet of water and silt, there, perfectly preserved in its fall, were enormous temple blocks inscribed with hieroglyphs, colossal statues of gods and kings, and stone weights used by harbor masters to measure cargo. Coins still gleamed with Ptolemaic faces, and jewelry lay where it must have slipped from someone's grasp as the city sank. The reason for its loss is the slow violence of earth and water combined. The delta ground is soft and restless, built from centuries of river mud, and under certain conditions, it can liquefy. Scientists believe an earthquake and a sudden soil collapse sometime around the 2nd or 3rd century BCE pulled whole districts down, breaking walls and swallowing streets. The sea then rose and spread over the ruins, sealing them away. What had been Egypt's greatest port, full of traffic and light, disappeared almost without a trace. Its memory washed thin until only a few classical writers still whispered its name. Farther along the coast, Alexandria itself, the dream city of Alexander, famed for its great library and its Pharos lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders, has also been gnawed away by the sea. The Pharos stood on Pharos Island for nearly 1,600 years, its light a steady beam for sailors until earthquakes in 956, 1303, and 1323 finally shattered it. Stone by stone, it toppled into the harbor, and over time the remains sank or were taken for new fortifications. The lighthouse that once defined a city and guided whole fleets was reduced to rubble beneath dark waves. Today, divers can see its blocks resting quietly where they fell, scattered across the seabed like dice from a giant's hand. The slow swallowing of these harbors is not only about geology and sea level. It is also about how quickly human worlds can slip from the map. Ports are built for movement, for ships coming and going, for people to arrive and depart, and when those flows change, when trade routes shift or empires crumble, the great harbors become empty mouths. The Nile changed course. Roman roads reoriented commerce. Other cities rose. Without constant use, breakwaters crumble, channels silt up, and the sea reclaims what no one tends. When divers go down today, their presence feels both scientific and elegiac. They bring cameras and lift bags and measure every fallen block. Yet there is something deeply human in their work, something like visiting a grave. In Alexandria's eastern harbor, explorers have found sphinxes and obelisks that once decorated palaces, and even fragments believed to be from Cleopatra's own royal quarter. Bronze coins stamped with her profile have been raised from the mud, bright after 2 millennia in darkness. In Heraklion, a massive red granite stele was found almost perfectly intact, still bearing the decrees of Pharaoh Nectanebo. These things rise from the seabed with silt trailing off like smoke, and each one is a breath of life from a drowned world. Yet for every piece we recover, there is more we will never know. Whose hands dropped those coins? What prayers echoed in the great temples before the quakes came? Did the people flee by ship, or did they have no warning? The water keeps its secrets well. Even as we map the seabed with sonar and lasers, we know that time has eaten context. Texts are gone, voices are gone. The daily life that gave meaning to these stones is silent forever. Standing at the modern shore, it is easy to forget how much lies just beyond the line where waves break. Tourists walk the Corniche in Alexandria, buying roasted nuts and watching fishing boats, unaware that not far out are entire palace districts and toppled colonnades. Fishermen cast nets above a city that once fed the Mediterranean with grain and ideas. In the Nile Delta, busy cargo ships pass within sight of where Heracleion thrived, its story gone until a few curious minds brought it back to light. These vanishing harbors remind us that even the most vital places can fade. They teach that no port is permanent, no trade so strong it cannot shift, no city so rich it cannot be undone by earth, sea, and time working together. And they leave us with an image at once humbling and hopeful, a diver's lamp sweeping across darkness, revealing the curve of a statue's cheek or the carved name of a forgotten ruler. It is proof that disappearance is never total, that some echoes survive long enough to be found, and that our own bustling shores might one day be read in the same patient way by those who come after. Searching through the quiet sea for what we once were, the ice does not seem alive when you first look at it. It lies across the north in great pale sheets that appear fixed and empty, a stillness so complete it is hard to believe it moves at all. Yet it is always moving, slow enough to hide its steps, and inside that frozen weight hole, ages of the earth are locked away. Scientists who work on the Greenland ice sheet know this intimately. They cut deep cores through miles of compacted snow, each layer a thin white memory of a single winter long past. And when those cylinders of ancient ice come up, they hold tiny bubbles of air, bits of pollen, even traces of volcanic ash that fell thousands of years ago. One core drawn from near summit. Station in the 1990s reached more than 2 miles down and carried a timeline. Back over 100,000 years. Past the last great ice age, into an older, warmer world. In that slender column were faint records of sudden freezes, unexpected thaws, storms and droughts no human wrote about yet, that still shape the world into which people were born. Sometimes, the ice gives up more than weather. On the edges of Greenland and across the Arctic, summers grow longer and meltwater runs in new streams, Hunters and archaeologists alike find what once was hidden. Wooden arrow shafts, bits of bone tools, scraps of hide, and even shoes appear as the ice retreats, belonging to lives lived on landscapes that were once open ground before the cold closed in. In Norway, a melting ice patch in Jotunheimen has revealed reindeer hunting gear and a well-preserved wool tunic more than 1,700 years old. In Canada's Yukon, caribou hunters walk among ice fields that now expose ancient throwing darts and sinew, bindings left by their ancestors centuries before. The Great Cold acted as a vault, sealing away each lost or discarded thing and keeping it intact until the present. Warmth unlocked the door. These finds speak of small, tough societies that thrived at the edges of the possible. People who tracked herds across tundra and knew each pass and valley intimately. They lived in a world of moving climate, for the ice was not always where it is now. When the last glacial maximum peaked around 20,000 years ago, sheets of ice as high as mountains covered much of North America and northern Europe. As the planet warmed, the ice melted and the land opened. New lakes formed, rivers found new paths, and humans followed retreating glaciers into places like Britain and the Canadian plains. For a time there was abundance. Fresh water, and fertile soil, but always with risk, because the same climate that gave could also take away. The story of Saka culture in Greenland is one such trace. For a long time, almost nothing was known about these early Arctic people who lived about 2500 BCE then. In the 1980s and 1990s, melting permafrost began releasing their tools, tiny blades of flint, wooden bows, and hair from their dogs. Later, DNA recovered from a clump of hair found in the frozen soil near Kikartasusek revealed a man who lived there 4,000 years ago. His genetic signature different from later Inuit, showing a vanished population that had crossed from Siberia but left no living descendants. His world was cold but navigable, a moment of relative warmth that allowed passage and hunting before shifting again and closing those routes with ice. It is hard not to feel the double edge of climate when you look at these discoveries. The same ice that now threatens to flood coasts as it melts once saved these small fragments of forgotten lives. Without the deep freeze, there would be no Sakak hair to study, no leather shoes to hold and wonder about. Yet the reason we see them now is because the climate is shifting again. It's time faster, pulling back covers that took millennia to form. Glaciers shrink, permafrost softens, and what they release comes with warnings in its meltwater, once rich. Hunting grounds can vanish as easily as they appeared. Even Greenland's deep cores show how abrupt these changes can be. Around 8,200 years ago, one layer records a sudden plunge in temperature that lasted 2 centuries, likely caused by a massive flood of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents. For the small bands of people living then, perhaps hunting along the edges of the great ice or fishing newly open waters, the cold's return would have changed everything. Camps would move or die, game would scatter, coastlines freeze again. There is no writing from that time, but the silence of abandoned tools and lost settlements is its own record. To walk where the ice has just retreated is to step between eras. A reindeer antler, polished by a man who lived before Rome existed, might appear beside the bootprint of a modern hiker. Melt pools form over ancient hunting paths, reflecting a sky filled with aircraft and satellites, while beneath the water lie traps once baited for caribou. It feels at once intimate and vast. The personal tide to the planetary climate shapes where life can grow and how long it can last. It builds worlds by carving valleys and feeding rivers, then erases them when temperatures tilt and water moves elsewhere. Every lost civilization has felt its force in some way, whether through drought, flood, or cold. The ice keeps the proof locked away until it decides to let go. And when it does, it whispers of how brief each foothold is. How survival has always been a narrow margin between seasons. Standing at the edge of a melting glacier, hearing the steady trickle of new streams cutting through ancient blue, one senses not only the past emerging, but also the present warning. The same power that buried these lives and protected them for thousands of years can just as easily sweep away ours. The cradle and the executioner are the same vast force, and the ice knows how to keep secrets and how to release them when it is time. The search began with hope. Though it was a quiet and patient hope, the sort that settles into long nights of listening, rather than shouting into the void. In the middle of the last century, as radio astronomy took shape and dishes began to rise from lonely fields, a few scientists wondered if those same instruments might hear something beyond the natural hum of the universe. By the 1960s, men like Frank Drake had pointed antennas toward nearby stars. Turning from pulsars and quasars to something more daring, the idea that perhaps other minds had left a trace. His 1960 project, Ozma, aimed at Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani, lasted only a few months and heard nothing but static and the occasional interference from passing aircraft, yet it lit a fuse. If it was possible to listen, then it was possible to hear, as the long vigil began. Over the decades, the work grew steadier, more methodical. The great radio observatories, Jodrell Bank in England, Green Bank in West Virginia, Arecibo in Puerto Rico, joined the watch. Their giant dishes, some spanning hundreds of feet, swept the sky not just for pulsars and hydrogen lines, but for something narrow and unnatural. A signal that would look different from the broad noise of stars and gas. Arecibo itself was a wonder, a 1,000-foot dish laid like a silver coin into a natural sinkhole, cables and towers holding its suspended feed, so sensitive it could detect a whisper of energy from across light dash years. In August 1977, at Ohio State University's Big Ear Radio Telescope, that hope flickered into something electric. Astronomer Jerry Emmon, reviewing a night's printout of numbers and letters that represented radio intensity, saw one sequence leap above the rest, 6EQUJ5, a sharp spike at the hydrogen line, exactly where one might expect an intelligent broadcast. He circled it in red pen and wrote, "Wow." In the margin, a single human shout in the long, quiet record. The signal had lasted 72 seconds. The time Big Ear's fixed beam would take to drift past a point in the sky, and then it was gone. No repeat, no follow-up. Teams swung antennas back again and again in the weeks and years that followed. But the place in Sagittarius where it came from stayed empty. The wow signal became both a talisman and a frustration. It was strong enough to be noticed, sharp enough to be unnatural, but it arrived only once. Maybe it was a transmission from a civilization aligning a narrow beam just so. Maybe it was an echo from a craft long silent. Maybe it was something prosaic, like a reflection or a passing comet. Though no explanation has satisfied everyone, its real power lies in what it implies, that if life does call out, the call may be fleeting. A flare in the dark that burns out before our instruments happen to be aimed and awake. SETI scientists often speak of a cosmic haystack, the near-infinite combinations of frequency, timing, and direction we must check to find even one deliberate signal. Our current search has swept only a thimbleful of that haystack. Civilizations, if they exist, could be broadcasting in some way we have not guessed, or not broadcasting at all. They may speak only briefly, perhaps across decades, before war, accident, or simple decline takes them. Or they may change technology beyond radio entirely. The way we have moved from Morse to fiber optics, leaving us listening on the wrong channel forever, a deeper fear shadows the listening, that by the time a signal arrives, it is already a memorial. Light and radio travel at finite speed, the wow. Signal took at least a century, and perhaps far longer to reach us. Even if it was deliberate, its makers might have fallen silent long before Jerry Emmon drew his red circle. In the 1990s, when Arecibo sent its own brief reply of sorts, beamed a coded message toward a globular cluster. 25,000 light-years away, the team knew that if someone there heard, we would be long gone before their answer could return. The distances stretch and distort any chance of conversation. They turn every attempt into archaeology. Still, people listen. The Allen Telescope Array in California now feeds streams of data into software that hunts for narrow signals. Breakthrough Listen, funded by Yuri Milner and supported by astronomers like Andrew Semyon, surveys the nearest million stars with unprecedented sensitivity. It is an act of both science and longing. Each time the data comes back empty or confusing, the watchers recalibrate and press on. driven less by easy hope than by stubbornness and curiosity. They know the odds, but also the stakes. If another civilization's call passed us by last century or last millennium, we will never know what we missed. But if we are lucky enough to be looking at the right time in the right way, one thin thread of sound could change the story of our species forever. Sometimes, when the night sky is clear and quiet and the instruments hum, the effort feels almost devotional. Each bit of noise combed and cross-checked. Each false positive weeded out. Satellites, cell towers, deep space probes is part of a patient ritual. At Greenbank, they once detected an intriguing pattern that turned out to be a microwave oven in the staff lounge. Its latch leaking radio waves when the door popped open. These are the kinds of small disappointments that mark the search. Tiny proofs of our own chatter drowning out the possible whispers of the stars. Yet beneath every setback is the same urge that moved Drake to start, that sent Emmons sifting through data, that rebuilt Arecibo after hurricanes and collapse threatened it. Somewhere far off, if life exists and endures long enough, it might speak. But we cannot know how often it fails, how many bright cultures flare and fade before we get our chance. And so we keep listening, knowing silence does not mean emptiness, only distance and time and maybe tragedy. The sky above us tonight might be full of ghosts, signals already spent, civilizations gone before we could even raise our hand to wave back at the end of the last. Ice Age, the world looked different in ways that are hard to imagine now, because so much of what was land then is ocean today. The great northern ice sheets locked up enormous amounts of water, lowering sea levels by more than 100 meters and pulling the coastline far outward, where now waves roll across the North Sea. Once there were wide meadows and low hills scattered with birch and pine, herds of red deer and aurochs moving through the mist. People lived there too, small bands of hunters and gatherers who left hearths of cracked flint and charred bone, simple huts framed with wood and covered in hides. They followed rivers that no longer exist, set traps in quiet marshes, and carved bone harpoons for fishing in shallow estuaries. That lost land is called Doggerland today, though it had no single name then. It's only a scattered network of lives tied to the rhythm of seasons and game. About 12,000 years ago, the climate began to warm sharply. Glaciers retreated and melt waters surged into the oceans, raising sea level at first slowly and then in pulses so sudden they would have seemed like disaster to anyone living close to shore. One such pulse, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 11,500 years ago, raised oceans several meters in just a few centuries, and later surges finished the work. Rivers that had wound peacefully through Doggerland were drowned. Marshes turned to tidal flats and then to sea. By about 6,500 BCE, the shallow channel we now call the English Channel had widened fully, and Britain was cut off from the continent. Archaeologists believe this happened in part through a single catastrophic event, the Storegga Slide, a massive submarine landslide off the coast of Norway around 6,200 BCE, which triggered a tsunami that swept across the lowlands of Doggerland. Imagine waking to the sound of rushing water and watching your world go under in hours. Forests and hearths gone forever. The same story unfolded on the other side of the world, across what is now Southeast Asia. During the last glacial maximum, the Sunda Shelf was a vast land bridge linking the Malay Peninsula with Sumatra, Java, and Borneo. Rivers braided across a plain larger than modern-day Europe, feeding dense forests and wetland valleys. As ice melted, seas poured in from the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, swallowing low country step by step until the land broke into islands. Human groups who had fished its rivers and planted the first gardens of taro and yam retreated to higher ground, their old paths lost beneath salt water. The story of a great flood echoes still in local myth. Tales from Java and Borneo speak of seas that rose and cut the world apart, of ancestors fleeing to hills while whole regions vanished. We know these vanished places not because they are visible, but because technology lets us look through water to find their ghosts. Marine archaeologists drag sonar across continental shelves. The images come back like black and white X-rays of another age. Off Britain, Multibeam sonar and seismic surveys have traced ancient riverbeds running across the North Sea floor. It's fresh and alive, now buried under silt. Fishing trawlers sometimes dredge up reminders: a barbed antler point, a mammoth bone, a polished stone axe. Each object is a stray message from a drowned world. Off the coast of India, near modern-day Dwarka, sonar revealed patterns of walls and foundations far out to sea, stirring debate about settlements older than known urban centers. In Southeast Asia, oil companies surveying the Sunda Shelf have produced maps showing an intricate drowned landscape, ridges that were once hills, deep valleys carved by rivers now flooded, possible lake basins where people once camped. Off the coast of Vietnam, stone tools and shell middens have been recovered by divers in what is now shallow water, but was once beach and estuary. These discoveries do more than satisfy curiosity. They change our sense of early human movement. The first farmers and fishers did not live only on the lands we see now. Many of their homes and fields are miles offshore under layers of sand and mud. It is humbling to realize that entire chapters of human story vanished in a single change of sea level. The settlements of Doggerland left no cities to crumble because they were small. But they were no less real, and their disappearance reshaped Europe. Britain's isolation after the flooding may have forced new adaptations. It's cut off exchange and created cultural breaks that archaeologists still trace. In Southeast Asia, the splitting of the landmass fragmented communities and turned neighbors into island peoples with diverging languages and traditions. The ocean did not only erase, it redrew maps of culture and survival. For those who search these sunken plains, the work is delicate. Divers move slowly across cold seabeds, stirring silt to reveal stones chipped by hands 10,000 years gone. Sometimes it is just a single tool, hint of a campfire site seen on sonar and then tested by core samples that bring up blackened wood. Each find feels improbable, like catching a whisper through rushing water. Yet every discovery shows how deeply tied to the sea we have always been, and how the sea in turn has never been fixed or gentle. Standing on a present-day shore, watching waves break and gulls wheel overhead, it is easy to think the boundary between land and ocean is stable, but it is not. It never has been. Our ancestors saw their homes drowned, and their descendants walked new coastlines. Some fled inland. Others adapted to boats and fishing, turning loss into a way forward. We know their story only now because science has given us eyes that can see through water and ears that can listen to the buried rivers. And as we uncover these drowned worlds, there is an undercurrent of warning. The seas are rising again, faster now than at any time in the lives of those early hunters. The line between land and water is shifting once more. The bones and hearths of Doggerland lay hidden for 8,000 years. The ruins of our own coastal cities may one day join them, to be found by some far-future diver running hands, across stone and steel and wondering who we were when the oceans rose. The earth gives no lasting promise of safety, and nowhere is that clearer than where fire meets the sea. In the heart of the Aegean, on the island now called Santorini, but once known as Thera, a volcano once rose in quiet slopes and terraced vineyards before tearing itself apart in one of the greatest eruptions the human world had yet seen. Sometime around the 16th century BCE, though scholars still debate the exact year, some say 1600, others 1628 based on tree rings and ice cores. The mountain exploded with a force that darkened skies as far away as Egypt and perhaps China. Whole sections of the island vanished as the sea rushed in, leaving behind the jagged caldera we see today. And with that event, something far larger than stone was lost. The Minoan civilization of Crete, vibrant and far-reaching, trading with Egypt and the Levant, making pottery alive with dolphins and lilies, seems to have stumbled in the disaster's wake, on Thera itself. The buried city of Akrotiri tells us how sudden it must have been. Streets still lie paved and clean beneath meters of hardened ash. Houses with stairs and frescoes remain almost as if the people only stepped out for a moment. Wall paintings show ships with proud prows and processions of saffron gatherers. In storerooms, amphorae still hold the ghost of oil and grain. Yet no bodies have been found there, a strange mercy that suggests warning came in time, perhaps in the days or weeks of tremors before the final blast. But while some may have fled the island, their wider world was not spared. The tsunami triggered by the collapse of Thera's volcanic cone swept across the Aegean, striking Crete's northern coast with waves that may have risen 30 feet or more. Ports would have been shattered, fleets tossed onto land, fields near the sea drowned in salt water. Knossos survived, but was wounded, and over the next centuries, the rhythm of Minoan power faltered until Mycenaean Greeks took its place. Centuries later, and far to the west, the same fierce chemistry of magma and water froze another civilization's heartbeat in an instant. On the morning of August 24th, 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted above the Bay of Naples. In Pompeii, ordinary life was unfolding. Bakers heating ovens, merchants selling olives and fish, children playing in the forum's shade. Then ash and pumice began to fall, first like dry snow, then heavier, building up feet deep in streets and forcing people to flee or shelter. By nightfall, a surge of gas and rock roared down the volcano's flank at speeds no one could outrun, searing the air to hundreds of degrees and sealing the city in an instant. What the Minoans lost to sea and time, the Romans left suspended in death. 2,000 years later, when excavators tunneled into Pompeii's ash, they found whole houses intact, wall paintings of Priapus weighing his fortune, mosaics of dogs guarding thresholds, loaves of bread still resting in ovens. And they found the people themselves, or rather the hollows where bodies had been. Early diggers learned to fill those voids with plaster, creating fragile casts of men, women, and children in their last postures, a mother shielding her child, a man with his face in his hands, a dog still chained where it had been left. There is no slower or kinder erasure here, only a moment caught forever. Volcanoes, for all their terror, are strange keepers of memory. The same ash and heat that kill also preserve. At Akrotiri, the paintings glow with color, unweathered because sunlight and rain never touched them after that day. At Pompeii, graffiti scratched on walls still tells jokes, boasts, and election slogans. Even at Herculaneum, where a hotter surge carbonized wood and scrolls, libraries of blackened papyrus still wait for deciphering by new scanning techniques. These places remind us that destruction and memory can arrive together, that the end of a city is not always the end of its story, yet the suddenness of it remains haunting. A culture can measure seasons, trade routes, dynasties, and yet have no defense when the ground shakes and the sky turns black. We know the Minoans mapped stars and traded copper and tin to shape bronze across continents, but none of that stopped the wave or soothed the famine that followed. We know the Romans built aqueducts and roads that reached to Britain, but the people in Pompeii still had only minutes once the surge broke free. What we call advanced does not always mean secure. Archaeologists working these sites often describe a feeling of trespass mixed with awe. In Pompeii, you walk along ruts worn by chariots and past frescoes, as bright as if painted yesterday. And it is easy to imagine the hum of voices, the smell of bread and wine, until you step into the shadow of a plaster cast and remember the cost of this clarity. In Santorini, you move through silent rooms where olive jars and weaving tools remain as their owners left them. And you realize that warning was not enough for the world they belonged to. Each eruption writes, without Thera's ash, we would not know so intimately how the Minoans lived. Without Vesuvius, we would not know the daily handwriting of Pompeii's bakers and slaves. These places are time machines because they stop the clock at a single instant, and when we peer inside, we see lives more clearly than through centuries of slow decay. Yet behind the wonder is a quiet warning. Cities may plan and trade and build, but the earth moves beneath them all the same. We may think ourselves secure with satellites and sensors, but so did the Romans with their aqueducts and the Minoans with their fleets. A single violent morning can undo centuries, leaving future wanderers to guess at what was lost and why it ended. Ash keeps secrets well, but it keeps them honestly too. It shows us a frozen day and invites us to remember that no civilization is beyond reach of the deep fires underfoot. Long before satellites drew clean blue lines across the top of the globe, the North was a place of guesswork and rumor. Mapmakers filled the blank white with shapes they could not confirm. Scattered islands, speculative channels. In the dream of a passage linking the Atlantic to the Pacific that would turn long voyages to Asia to a swift cut through the Arctic ice, the lure of the Northwest Passage drew nations and men across centuries, promising wealth and fame to anyone who could find and hold it. But the cold did not care about promises. It waited, silent and patient, for each new ship to test itself against waters that were not always water at all, but shifting plates of ice hard as stone. Among the most haunting of these attempts was the Franklin expedition, launched in 1845 with all the confidence of Victorian Britain at its imperial height. 2 stout ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, left the Thames under the command of Sir John Franklin, a seasoned naval officer in his late 50s. With 128 men and supplies meant to last 3 years, they carried tinned food and newly invented cans, libraries of books, fine china for their officers' tables, and a hand-cranked organ to keep spirits up. They also carried the pride of a nation sure that technology and discipline could master any wild place. The ships vanished into the labyrinth of channels north of Canada and were not seen again by European eyes. Searches followed, year after year, as Britain refused to accept the silence. Dozens of rescue expeditions scoured the Arctic, some themselves falling victim to ice and hunger. Inuit communities, long at home in that harsh world, saw the strangers pass and sometimes guided or aided them, but their warnings about conditions often went unheeded. Over time, a slow and terrible picture emerged. From relics and scattered reports, it seemed Erebus and Terror were trapped in ice near King William Island, frozen fast through to winters until Franklin died and command passed to Francis Crozier. In April 1848, the surviving crew finally abandoned the ships, attempting a desperate march south toward the Back River. They never reached safety. Inuit testimony told of starving men dragging sledges piled with odd Victorian goods across melting snow. Skeletons found later on King William Island showed cut marks that whispered of the final extremities of hunger, the tragedy left behind. Curious relics that feel like messages from the edge. A single note, preserved in a cairn at Victory Point and discovered in 1859 by the explorer Francis Leopold McClintock. Records in crisp naval script the departure of the ships, the death of Franklin, and the crew's plan to trek south. It is brief and stark, just enough to confirm the broad shape of the disaster and nothing of the human feeling inside it. Scattered across the tundra, other objects turned up, silver forks engraved with officers' names, boots, buttons, even a sailor's journal fragment too water-damaged to read. They are like punctuation marks in a long blank page, the remains of men who pushed so far into a silence that swallowed their voices. Yet the hunger to push farther did not die with them. Each failure seemed only to sharpen the fascination. The Arctic promised a reward that was less about trade routes than about proving mastery over the last unbroken frontier. Expeditions by men like Roald Amundsen, who finally navigated the Northwest Passage in 1903, 1906 in the small ship. Gia, by listening closely to Inuit ways and wintering with them for years, succeeded not by overpowering the ice, but by respecting it and learning its patterns. Amundsen's victory came from humility more than technology. Yet even his slow progress underscored how dangerous the passage remained. In some ways, the Franklin expedition stands as a mirror for every age that has believed its tools could outrun nature. The Victorians had steam engines, canned food, and magnetic compasses. Today we have satellites and nuclear ships, yet ice still swallows vessels when weather shifts. As when the Russian cruise ship Lyubov Orlova went adrift and vanished in 2013. Or when modern cargo ships get locked in early freeze. The North gives ground when it chooses and takes it back without warning. There is something deeply human, almost mythic, in the willingness to risk everything for a blank space on a map. It is not only about commerce or strategy, but about the need to know. To stand somewhere no one from your world has stood and leave a mark. Franklin and his men carried flags and fine silver as if ceremony could tame wilderness. They died, but their story outlived them and still draws ships and cameras northward. When Parks Canada divers finally found HMS Erebus in 2014 and HMS Terror in 2016, lying on the seafloor in cold black water, it was as if the silence itself had decided to loosen its hold for a moment. The ships were astonishingly preserved, tables still set, decks intact under a skin of algae, Victorian world waiting in the dark. Looking at these stories now, you feel both admiration and unease. The same drive that mapped the Arctic-built railways, spanned oceans, and eventually put machines on the moon. But it also sent men to slow deaths on ice, because retreat seemed worse than failure. The wrecks and cairns remind us that exploration is rarely clean or safe. It is made of ambition, misunderstanding, and sometimes quiet doom. Yet we still hunger to know. Satellites map melting sea lanes, cruise ships follow Franklin's ghostly track, and under summer's brief thaw, the Arctic opens again. It's just enough to tempt passage. The maps are no longer empty in the way they were, but the silence remains. You can stand on King William Island today, under an endless pale sky, and feel how far Franklin and his crew were from help. How alone they were when the ice closed around them. It is a silence thick enough to swallow shouts. A silence that waited for them, and waits still. Daring the next voice to call out and risk being lost in its cold breath, long before telescopes or satellites. Humans look to the sky with the same mix of awe and necessity that makes people today track weather or mark time. And they marked those observations in ways that could survive centuries. Even millennia, if the wind and rain did not erase them first. In the deserts of southern Peru, the Nazca lines stretch across the plain in vast geometric shapes and figures of birds. Monkeys and spiders, some hundreds of meters long, their shallow grooves traced in earth and stone so carefully that they can only be fully appreciated from above. Scholars estimate they were created between 500 BCE and 500 CE. Yet for nearly 1,000 years their purpose was a mystery. Some lines point to distant mountains, others seem to track solstices or other solar events. The people who built them, working without metal tools, relied on observation and memory to lay straight lines across the desert, connecting earth and sky in a quiet, lasting dialogue, thousands of kilometers away and thousands of years earlier. In the caves of Lascaux in southwestern France, humans were drawing on stone in a dark world of flickering torchlight. Around 17,000 years ago, they painted bulls, horses, and deer across uneven walls and ceilings, often using the contours of the rock to make the animals almost come alive. Some researchers suggest that certain paintings were aligned with the movement of stars or seasonal changes, though evidence is debated. The hunters and gatherers who made them had no written language, yet they encoded patterns and stories into pigment and rock that would survive ice ages and the slow erosion of time. Their astronomy may have been embedded not in formulas, but in rhythm, knowing when the seasons would turn, when herds would migrate, when the nights would lengthen, and committing that knowledge to walls that could speak even after their makers vanished. Even older than these examples is Göbekli Tepe, perched on a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, built around 9600 BCE, long before agriculture fully took root. Massive stone pillars, some 20 feet tall, and carved with reliefs of animals and abstract symbols, form circular enclosures whose purpose is still partially a mystery. Researchers like Klaus Schmidt, who led excavations in the 1990s and 2000s, suggested that some of the carvings may encode celestial observations, marking the movements of stars, the timing of seasons, or perhaps even tracking cycles that mattered to early communities of hunter-gatherers. Unlike the caves or lines of Nazca, these stones were quarried and arranged with intention that spoke not only to gods or spirits, but also to the careful observation of the sky. It is easy to imagine people kneeling before them, counting the nights, aligning rituals with the rising of distant suns, leaving their knowledge etched into the world in the hope it might endure beyond themselves. Stone is memory, but it is not eternal. The Nazca lines, once clearer in contrast between reddish surface stones and lighter subsoil, have been worn by wind and rain, by trucks and road construction, and much of what remains is a shadow of the original work. Lascaux was discovered only in 1940 and immediately threatened by mold and human presence, requiring careful closure to preserve what had survived for tens of thousands of years. At Göbekli Tepe, centuries of wind, rain, perhaps deliberate burying by its own builders covered the site with soil, both protecting and hiding it from view. Even carved granite and limestone crack, break, and crumble with time, so that what archaeologists uncover is always partial. A fragmentary dialogue with people, disappeared long before anyone could read their full message. These marks in stone and earth show an urge that is deeply human to fix a place in the cosmos. To say, I see you, and I know my place beneath your light. They remind us that people measured, observed, and recorded without paper, computers, or telescopes, relying on memory and ingenuity to align their lives with rhythms they could not control but could predict. Across deserts, caves, and hilltops, the sky was mapped in line and pigment. In relief and circle, a network of knowledge made tangible. They lived, they counted, they observed, and then the generations passed. The deserts shifted, the caves were sealed. The hilltops were buried, and their creators faded. And yet, even fractured, even incomplete, these works speak. A bird etched in Nazca, a horse in Lascaux, a relief of a fox on Göbekli Tepe, they are voices reaching out across time. They are records of people looking up, tracking suns and stars, understanding cycles of light and season, and daring to mark the earth so that someone far in the future might see and wonder. The stones are memory made material, fragile yet stubborn, holding hints of what once mattered, and reminding us that even as stone breaks, the urge to know, to record, and to connect with the vast sky above is remarkably enduring. There is a certain ache that comes when we think about the knowledge that has slipped beyond reach, not because no one ever found it, but because it was gathered and then undone in a single burst of heat and smoke. The image that rises most often is of the Library of Alexandria, that legendary place at the edge of the Mediterranean where scholars 2,000 years ago tried to hold the whole world's learning in one set of walls. Founded, tradition says, by Ptolemy II Philadelphus in the 3rd century BCE, it was more than just a building full of scrolls. It was a living network of minds. Ships docking in Alexandria's busy harbor were said to have their manuscripts seized for copying. The originals kept and duplicates returned. Travelers and scholars, men like Euclid, Eratosthenes, Archimedes walked its colonnades and read works from Greece, Egypt, India, Mesopotamia, and beyond. There may have been hundreds of thousands of papyrus rolls, containing plays and histories now lost, treatises on medicine and astronomy that might have changed how we built our future. Yet those shelves did not survive. The exact moment and cause of destruction are still argued over, as if history itself resists clarity here. Some point to Julius Caesar in 48 BCE, who during civil war set fire to his own ships to block the fleet of Ptolemy XIII and let the flames jump to the docks and nearby buildings. Others think later waves of violence, Emperor Aurelian's capture of the city in the 3rd century CE, or the decrees of Theophilus and the Christian mob against pagan temples in 391, each took a share of the collection. Still others say the Serapeum, a sister library, may have lasted until the Muslim conquest centuries later, when new rulers cleared away what remained. The truth is probably not one single night, but a slow unweaving across centuries, with fire and neglect joining hands. What matters is the silence that followed. When the papyrus rolls went up, so did voices. Plays of Sophocles we never saw, mathematical works beyond Euclid, histories from Carthage, treatises on lost medicine, astronomical charts that may have recorded observations long before Ptolemy of later fame. Eratosthenes, who measured the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, worked there. What other calculations were lost beside his? Hipparchus charted the stars and may have left records that would have advanced astronomy by centuries. They, too, are gone. One blaze or sack of a city can undo generations of careful copying and gathering, because papyrus and parchment are as mortal as the hands that write on them. The cost of fragile record-keeping is seen not just in Alexandria, but wherever words once flourished and then perished. In China, Emperor Qin Shi Huang's infamous book burnings in 213 BCE, meant to standardize thought, destroyed ancient philosophical and historical texts. Later scholars spent centuries trying to rebuild Confucian classics from scraps and memory. In the Americas, Mayan codices, brilliant painted books folded like screens and filled with hieroglyphs, were mostly destroyed by Spanish priests in the 16th century. Only a handful survive. In Baghdad in 1258, the libraries of the House of Wisdom, with centuries of Arabic, Persian, and Greek learning, were thrown into the Tigris by Mongol forces. The river said to have run black with ink for days. Paper and papyrus were miracles when first used. Light and portable compared to stone, yet they always carried risk. A shelf of scrolls can vanish in an afternoon if flame or water comes. A single siege can end an age of careful copying. Even without violence, damp and insects and time can turn pages to powder. It is striking to think how close we came to losing more. The works of Aristotle survived largely because they were hidden for centuries in Asia Minor and found again by chance. The plays of Aeschylus and Euripides we have are only a fragment of what once existed. Most early Greek lyric poetry survives in stray quotations by later writers, a ghost held together by accident. Standing inside any library today, with lights humming and climate control whispering, it is easy to forget how vulnerable words have been through most of history. A torch, a flood, a hasty flight ahead of an army, that was enough to silence whole civilizations. When we speak of the Dark Ages, part of what we mean is not ignorance but absence. The lights going out because the scrolls burned and could not be replaced. Knowledge lives in memory and in fragile containers, and when those containers fail, rebuilding takes lifetimes. The Library of Alexandria has become a symbol because it is a wound with no clear edges. A place we cannot quite visit yet, cannot forget. We imagine those rooms filled with careful hands and quiet minds, scrolls unrolling across polished tables, and then we imagine the smoke. Even if we have some of that learning today in other forms, we know that countless first voices are gone, original insights replaced by later attempts. It is a reminder that progress is not a straight road. It is a fragile inheritance carried by the written word. If stone breaks, paper burns faster. Our ancestors turned to stone for memory, carving on walls and pillars to resist time. But as writing spread the need for speed and volume won out, papyrus could be made quickly and shipped cheaply. Parchment and paper even more so. That trade gave us literature and science and history at a scale stone could never hold. But it also meant that one fire, one season of neglect, could collapse entire chains of thought. And yet there is something stubborn in the human urge to write again. Each time knowledge is lost, people rebuild, copy, and search for fragments. Scholars have pieced together lost Greek plays from papyrus scraps found in Egyptian rubbish heaps at Oxyrhynchus. Digital archivists now scan and preserve even brittle medieval manuscripts so that a single blaze cannot take them. But the ache remains because we know how much is already beyond reach. The library that burned is also the one that warns, teaching how easily a bright world can go dim when memory has no refuge but fragile pages and a hope for safety that history rarely grants. Deep in the lowlands of Guatemala and Mexico, the forest grows so thick and heavy with life that light itself feels slowed. And for centuries, that slow green tide has been at work burying whole worlds. The Maya built their cities wide and proud with causeways, temples, and palaces that glimmered under the tropical sun. They studied the heavens, traced the cycles of Venus and the moon, carved stelae that counted time across centuries, and raised stepped pyramids that were meant to last. But after their great age waned between the 8th and 10th centuries, the jungle began to reclaim what people left behind. Roots forced their way into cracks, heavy branches shaded out plazas, and thick mats of moss and liana vines spread over stairways and carvings until cities disappeared. So completely that later travelers could walk across temple roofs and never know they stood above stone. Early outsiders who stumbled on these ruins often described shock at seeing civilization swallowed alive. In 1839, the American explorer and writer John Lloyd Stephens and the artist Frederick Catherwood traveled through Honduras and Guatemala, hearing rumors of stone cities deep in the forest. At Copen, Stephens wrote of carved figures half strangled by roots, steely tilted under enormous ceiba trees, and stairways so choked with plants he had to cut his way through. The pair moved on to Palenque in Chiapas, Mexico, where roof combs and sculpted kings emerged from walls of green. Catherwood's drawings, detailed and almost photographic, brought home to the Western world the astonishing fact that a sophisticated people had thrived here, charting the skies and building palaces with no iron tools and no beasts of burden, and then had slipped away, leaving the forest to erase their story. Archaeologists followed, clearing plazas and recording glyphs, yet progress was painfully slow. A single site could take decades to map because each pyramid and causeway lay under meters of soil and vegetation. The forest not only hides, but protects and destroys at once. Vines pry stones apart, while also holding walls upright. Moisture feeds moss, but also rot. The Maya themselves, of course, had never disappeared. Their descendants lived and farmed around these ruins, carrying language and memory forward. But the great ceremonial centers in their full scope were lost to human eyes for centuries. Then, in the 21st century, technology gave a new kind of sight. Using LiDAR light detection and ranging, archaeologists began to fly small aircraft or drones over jungle canopies, sending down thousands of pulses of laser light that pass between leaves and return with precise measurements of the ground below. When those pulses are mapped, the vegetation falls away in the image like a curtain, and the buried city appears. In 2018, a major LiDAR survey in northern Guatemala revealed more than 60,000 previously unknown structures around the Maya heartland roads. Terraces, palaces, whole networks of defense walls and irrigation. The sheer scale stunned researchers. What had been thought of as isolated ceremonial centers proved to be parts of densely connected urban worlds, supporting perhaps 10 million people at their height. This new vision does more than redraw maps. It changes how we understand the rise and decline of the Maya. The long, straight causeways called sakbibs stretch across swamp and hill, linking places once assumed distant. Terraces and canals show an engineering grasp of water and soil management long underestimated. Defensive earthworks and ramparts suggest conflicts and political rivalries more intense than previously believed. All of it lay just a few meters below our feet. Invisible because trees and vines write over stone with a slow but relentless script. Yet even as LiDAR gives us new clarity, the ruins themselves remind us of fragility. The Maya long count calendar once traced time with mathematical precision deeper than anything Europe had then. Inscriptions predicted eclipses and celebrated dynasties with complex glyphs, but many stelae have fallen or crumbled. Moisture erodes plaster where brilliant red and blue pigments once shone. In Copen's hieroglyphic stairway, thousands of glyphs still climb the steps, but some are worn almost smooth. Tikkel's temples rise above the canopy like islands, yet much of their stone is weakened by roots and rain. Nature erases in a way both brutal and patient. It covers, cracks, and feeds on the very monuments meant to outlast it. To walk in these places is to feel time differently. In Tikal, Guatemala, you climb Temple IV and see endless forest rolling to the horizon, broken only by the tops of other pyramids like green-covered mountains. The calls of howler monkeys echo, where once came drums and conch shells. At Palenque, you can run your hand over glyphs that still show the faces of kings like Pakal the Great, who ruled in the 7th century, and realize his words nearly vanished under moss until a chance discovery brought them back. In Calakmul, Mexico, deep in the jungle, whole neighborhoods sleep untouched. Because excavation itself can harm them once roots and earth are gone, there is wonder, but also warning in these buried cities. Even a culture with advanced astronomy, architecture, and writing can recede until only scattered farmers remember its name. Political collapse, drought, warfare, whatever mix of forces broke the classic Maya. World left their cities empty long enough for nature to swallow the evidence. Without records strong enough to resist climate and conquest, knowledge turns into mystery, yet the stones do speak, even if faintly. LiDAR has shown that nothing is ever completely lost if we keep looking. Roads and terraces still remember their makers. Kings still lift their faces from glyphs. Observatories still line up with solstices and Venus risings. The jungle's cover was both grave and safe box. It muffled sound but guarded what lay below until tools sharp enough to peel back its veil arrived. Standing at the edge of a cleared plaza today, with ruins rising out of a sea of green, you feel a double truth: how easily greatness can be hidden, and how powerful the drive is to uncover it. The forest writes over stone, but curiosity is a strong pen. And so long as there are eyes to search and light to send through leaves, the lost can still be found. Whispering of calendars that measured the stars and cities that believed themselves permanent under a sky that never promised permanence at all. The sea has always been a road and a grave at the same time, carrying trade and armies and pilgrims, while swallowing the evidence of their passing with a patience that feels almost deliberate. Its surface can seem calm and empty, but beneath, where light fails and pressure builds, lies a long museum without walls. Wooden hulls, bronze weapons, marble statues. Whole fleets have slipped under waves and settled on silt, slowly turning into reefs or silent vaults. Each wreck is a sealed room of another time, preserved by cold and darkness, waiting for someone curious or lucky enough to find it. Among the most haunting of these sunken rooms is the site off the tiny Essequias island of Antikythera, where in the spring of 1900 sponge divers, working shallow waters, took shelter from a storm and decided to explore deeper. They returned to their boat pale and shaken, speaking of corpses lying on the seabed. What they thought were bodies were in fact life-sized bronze and marble statues, arms and torsos scattered across rocks. Word reached Athens, and soon ships returned with archaeologists to raise treasures. Statues of philosophers, horsemen, and gods, fine glassware, coins, jewelry, all from a Roman-era ship that sank around the 1st century BCE. But among the cargo, corroded and unremarkable at first glance, was something stranger, a lump of green bronze with gears inside. That object would come to be known as the Antikythera mechanism. And over the next century of study, it would shift how we think about ancient technology. When X-rays and CT scans finally peered through its crust in the early 2000s, they revealed more than 30 interlocking bronze gears of extraordinary precision, teeth cut so finely they could predict the cycles of the sun and moon, track eclipses, and model the movements of planets as known to Greek astronomy. Inscriptions on its plates named games at Olympia and calendars of the zodiac. It was, in essence, a mechanical computer built 2,000 years ago, the likes of which we thought did not exist until medieval clockmakers. Some scholars believe it descended from designs of Hipparchus or Archimedes, but no other comparable devices survived. It lay at the bottom of the sea for 2 millennia, its makers forgotten, its line of craft cut off perhaps by war or economic collapse. Until an accident brought it back into light, the Antikythera wreck is not alone in reminding us how much the sea has hidden. Ancient trade routes were arteries of civilization, and storms or battle could slice them without warning. Off Sicily and Crete, divers have found rams from triremes, bronze beaks meant to crush enemy hulls, scattered like teeth on the seabed, the silent record of naval battles no longer described in surviving texts. In the Black Sea, where oxygen poured depths, slow decay. Shipwrecks thousands of years old rest almost untouched, their timbers still joined, cargo still stacked. One vessel found at 2,000 meters depth, a Greek trading ship from about 400 BCE, sits with its mast upright and rudders in place, like something set gently on the bottom rather than lost in disaster. It shows shipbuilding techniques once only guessed from pottery paintings. Now confirmed by wood still holding its pegs and joints, the sea's dark cold makes it both destroyer and archivist. Salt and waves break apart what floats. Currents scatter cargo and crush wood. But in deeper, colder places where no light and little oxygen reach, preservation becomes uncanny. Amphorae filled with oil or wine remain sealed under sediments. Roman glass still glimmers blue-green. Coins bear clear faces of emperors long dead. On rare occasions, even rope or fabric endures, offering a tactile connection across centuries, yet these finds are almost always incomplete. We pull up a statue, but not the sculptor's name. A ship, but not its logbook. A machine like the Antikythera, but none of the workshop where it was born. Knowledge can be drowned even when the artifact survives. The mechanism shows ancient Greece capable of extraordinary engineering. Yet we have no manuals, no surviving chain of craftsmen who passed down the craft. It is as if a lighthouse winked on and off across time, proof of brilliance that flared and then vanished. Modern technology is pushing further into this deep archive. Remote-operated vehicles and submersibles now roam depths that would crush human lungs, scanning wrecks with sonar and photographing details that would vanish at a diver's touch. The Black Sea Maritime Archaeology Project has mapped dozens of ships spanning 2,500 years off Egypt's coast. The once thriving ports of Canopus and Heracleion, cousins to the city found earlier, have given up colossal statues and everyday utensils alike. Even near the Bahamas, the search for long-rumored fleets of treasure galleons continues to surface artifacts that tell quieter, more human stories than gold. A sailor's pipe, a child's shoe, a ship's bell. Each recovery is a conversation with the deep, but always on the sea's terms. Storms can close a site overnight. Shifting sand can bury a hull for another 1,000 years. Even with robotics and mapping, we still know very little about the full record down there. Millions of wrecks are believed to lie undiscovered across the planet's oceans, each with its own small world of knowledge and craft. Locked inside, to imagine what we have already lost is to feel how thin the line of memory is. A device like the Antikythera mechanism proves that intellectual peaks can vanish almost overnight if trade, peace, or patronage falter. A storm in the Aegean erased not just a ship, but a whole line of technological heritage. Great navies have perished, leaving no trace but barnacled bronze rams. Merchants and pilgrims sank with scrolls and maps we'll never read. Yet there is hope in the fact that the sea sometimes chooses to give back. Divers brushing silt from a carved face, ROVs gliding through black water to illuminate timbers and amphorae. Scientists scanning corroded lumps to reveal delicate gear trains. These are acts of patience that counter the forgetting. The ocean's vault is vast and dark, but not impenetrable. And every time something rises from it, we are reminded that our picture of the past is still unfinished. Standing on a quiet shore, watching the tide erase footprints and carry away foam, it is strange to think that somewhere just beyond sight, a ship sleeps whole, its lanterns dark, its cargo waiting. The deep keeps secrets, but it also keeps testimony. In its slow, crushing silence, it has been saving messages for anyone persistent enough to ask. On a warm afternoon in 1950, 4 physicists at Los Alamos were talking casually as they left lunch and strolled back toward their lab. The conversation skipping from topics of nuclear weapons to cartoons in the New Yorker about flying saucers. One of them, the Italian-born genius Enrico Fermi, fell silent for a while, and then suddenly broke in with a question so simple it startled everyone. Where's everybody? It was half a joke, half a puzzle. If the universe is so vast, with hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy alone, and planets likely circling many of them, and if life is not impossibly rare, why do we see no sign of anyone else? No ships, no signals, no ruins shimmering on the edges of our telescopes, only silence and cold distance. That question has come to be known as the Fermi paradox, and it cuts deeper the more you think about it. In the decades since Fermi spoke, astronomy has shown that planets are common. We have found thousands by measuring how stars wobble or dim. Many sit in the so-called habitable zone, where water could exist as liquid and warmth might support biology. Some are older than Earth by billions of years, meaning if life began there, it had an enormous head start. And yet, despite radio telescopes scanning the skies for decades, despite spacecraft sweeping past moons and sending back images of strange worlds, we have heard nothing certain and seen nothing clear. One way scientists try to explain this silence is with something they call the great filter, not a wall we can touch, but an idea, a barrier somewhere along the path from lifeless rock to a galaxy-spanning civilization. Life might arise often, but stumble and die before it can spread far enough to be noticed. The filter could sit early in the leap from chemistry to the first cells, making even simple life rare. It could sit later, perhaps at the step from single-celled to complex multicellular creatures. Or later still at the point of intelligence and technology. Or, and this is what chills many thinkers, the filter could lie ahead of us, somewhere between reaching modern industry and surviving long enough to speak. We tend to picture crowded skies and starships cruising between suns. But time and distance work against that dream. Our own radio signals have been leaking into space for just over a century, meaning the nearest star systems are only now reaching the first echoes of Marconi in early broadcasts. Anything farther than 100 light-years remains unaware of us. Meanwhile, even our fastest probes crawl at fractions of a percent of light speed. A voyage to the nearest known Earth-like exoplanet would take tens of thousands of years. For us to be seen, or for us to see others, requires a delicate overlap. A civilization needs to be transmitting or traveling at just the moment we're looking, and close enough for its signal or ship to cross gulfs that are staggeringly wide. It is sobering to think how easy it would be to miss one another. A society might invent radio, build cities, and then collapse in nuclear fire, famine, or self-made climate disaster before it has a chance to send more than a century of signals. Another might turn inward, choosing quiet technologies we cannot detect, using fiber optics and narrow beams instead of the wide leakage we rely on. Even if some reach the stars, the travel times mean that by the time explorers arrive anywhere, the sender's own home may be long dead, leaving wanderers without a base and strangers without context. This idea that intelligence blooms and then vanishes before it can be found haunts many who search. It would mean the universe could be full of brief sparks, cultures that learn to build machines and towers that perhaps even call out once or twice and then go dark. Their worlds left quiet, except for ruins no one can visit. We might be looking across oceans of time at places where life once stirred but now is gone. The echoes already faded by the time they could reach us. Yet the silence is not proof of despair, only mystery. Our tools are still new and small compared to the scale we face. We have only listened seriously for a few decades, and only across a narrow slice of possible frequencies. We may have passed through 1,000 alien stations but tuned to the wrong channel. We may be peering for smoke while others use lasers or something stranger. Or perhaps the simple truth is that distances make neighbors into ghosts. Even if civilizations endure, they are too far and too slow to show themselves within the thin slice of time our species has existed. But Fermi's question lingers because it touches something personal. We are a young species, just learning to cross our own planet easily and to peer beyond. We have tasted power that can destroy us as easily as it can sustain us. The great filter, if real and still ahead, might be our own inability to survive what we create. Weapons, environmental collapse, technologies we cannot master. The paradox is not just about them. It is about us, and whether we can outlast our adolescence long enough to join whatever conversation may exist. Still, curiosity drives us on. We build bigger radio arrays, plan new probes, dream of interstellar sails and long-duration habitats. Each signal we send, the plaques on Pioneer, the gold record on Voyager. The Arecibo message is a small act of faith against the Fermi wall. A way of saying we are here and hope to still be here when an answer comes, even if that answer takes thousands of years. And maybe the very search matters, even if it never succeeds, because it keeps us looking outward, aware that we are not alone in possibility. If not yet in proof, so the sky remains quiet tonight. Stars scattered and cold, yet heavy with questions. Somewhere there may have been watchers like us, once leaning over their own instruments, once drawing their own maps of the galaxy. Maybe they too asked, "Where is everyone?" before the silence claimed them. Our work, for now, is to listen and to endure, because survival itself may be the only way through the dark in the early 15th century, the horizon of the known world widened suddenly when enormous ships from China appeared. Across the Indian Ocean, they belonged to the Ming dynasty and sailed under the command of Admiral Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan, whose voyages would become the stuff of quiet wonder. Beginning in 1405, with fleets so vast that some chroniclers claimed hundreds of vessels and tens of thousands of men, Zheng He traveled to Java, Ceylon, Calicut, Hormuz, and even the coast of East Africa. His flagship was said to stretch more than 120 meters, dwarfing the caravels that a century later would carry Europeans across the Atlantic. These expeditions brought porcelain, silks, and lacquer to distant ports, returned with giraffes and spices, and established China as a visible and confident power connected to a wide ocean world. Yet after 7 grand voyages ending around 1433, the ships returned home and never sailed again. The reasons remain layered and tangled. The court that had sponsored Zheng He changed its mood after Emperor Yonggle's death. His successors, especially Emperor Hongxi and later Emperor Xuandi, looked inward and found the voyages costly and politically suspect. Court factions hostile to the eunuchs, who had led maritime policy, argued that the great fleets drained the treasury and distracted from defending the northern frontier against Mongol incursions. They feared commerce might empower private merchants and foreign contacts beyond imperial control. And so, within a generation, shipyards went quiet. Records of the voyages were scattered or destroyed. Naval maps disappeared into archives or were deliberately burned. By 1500, the once mighty treasure fleet had faded almost completely from state memory. The world beyond the South China Sea might as well have been sealed behind mist. A similar silence took shape centuries later across the seas in Japan. In the early 17th century, after decades of war and European contact, the Tokugawa shogunate faced a country that had known upheaval, missionary zeal, and foreign traders eager for influence. The shoguns, seeking stability above all, enacted sakoku, the policy of closed country. Beginning formally with edicts in the 1630s, Christianity was banned. Japanese were forbidden to travel abroad. Foreign ships were turned away except for tightly controlled Dutch and Chinese enclaves at Nagasaki. The aim was control, keep the peace, protect the social order, and reduce the threat of foreign weapons and ideas destabilizing the carefully built hierarchy of samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants. For more than 2 centuries, Japan lived behind these legal walls. Its people continued to farm, build, and create with extraordinary skill. But the scientific and geographic knowledge flowing elsewhere largely bypassed them. Western astronomy, new ship designs. The global spread of maps and clocks and printing moved on without Japanese participation, except in narrow, regulated windows known as Rangaku Dutch learning that filtered bits of medicine and engineering through Nagasaki. Maps of the world grew richer in Europe, showing coastlines shaped by telescopes and sextants, but in Japan, older styles persisted. Not until Commodore Matthew Perry forced open ports with his black ships in 1853 did the outside world return in force, and the shock of sudden comparison was immediate. Both China's retreat and Japan's seclusion were not collapses brought by invaders or plagues, but deliberate choices shaped by fear and politics. In Beijing, officials looked at the Great Wall and saw danger from the steppe. Preferring to invest in armies for land defense rather than open seas they could not fully control, they believed China was already the center. Why risk distant, unpredictable waters? In Edo, the shogunate watched European empires consume parts of Asia and feared the same fate. Better to shut the door and hold tight to what was theirs. For a time, these inward turns seemed prudent. Stability followed in Japan. China's Ming dynasty held for almost 3 centuries more. But both choices left deep shadows when Europeans eventually sailed deeper and faster. China's absence at sea meant it played no role in shaping new maritime routes or claiming lands. The great shipyards that once built treasure junks lost their craft. Later, Qing emperors would struggle to counter Western navies with fleets far inferior to Zheng He's armadas. Japan, insulated from technological revolutions, faced the abrupt humiliation of Western gunboats and had to race through the Meiji Restoration to catch up after centuries of controlled stagnation. Each example shows how a civilization can become invisible by its own hand, shutting off contact, erasing its map from the shared ocean of ideas. There is a strange double feeling when studying these histories. On one side, a kind of admiration. Leaders protected order, stopped immediate chaos, and kept their worlds coherent. On the other, a long ache, because we see what might have been if curiosity had outweighed fear. China's fleets could have reached the Cape of Good Hope decades before Portugal, perhaps altering the story of empire. Japan's scholars, given freer flow of science, might have joined global astronomy or medicine far earlier. Instead, knowledge curled inward, like a tide leaving shore, and when it returned it did so with a shock. The lesson is not simple. It's because every age has reason to close itself off. Trade brings risk as well as wealth. Ideas bring unrest, along with discovery. But the records of vanished fleets and sealed ports show how quickly a culture can step back from the wider human conversation. What is hidden does not always survive waiting. Maps unrolled in secret rooms, ship plans left to rot, astronomical charts burned for safety. These losses are quiet but vast. Standing today in Nanjing, at the great stone docks where Zhenghe's ships were built, the river flows in different past moss-covered steps. In Nagasaki, the old Dutch factory at Dejima is a museum, showing the single narrow bridge that once connected Japan to the rest of the world. These places feel both safe and sad, monuments to decisions meant to guard, but that ended by erasing presence. Civilizations can vanish not only by disaster, but by retreat. Sometimes the walls we build to survive end up hiding us so well that, for those outside, we might as well not exist at all. When we first looked beyond our own planet with serious instruments, it was easy to dream that travel between stars might someday be no more distant than sailing between continents. The imagination leapt ahead of the math, picturing caravans of ships crossing the night. But the deeper we measured, the more the truth stretched out cold and patient. The stars are far beyond anything our lives or even our civilizations have yet learned to endure. The light we see tonight from Alpha Centauri left before the First World War. The Milky Way alone is 100,000 light-years across. Even if we could push a ship to speeds that seem heroic, say 1/10 the speed of light, far beyond what we can now, it would take 40 years to reach our nearest neighbor, and that is only to arrive. Not to return or to send word back. The spacecraft we have actually built move with a pace that humbles every dreamer. Voyager 1, launched in 1977, and now in interstellar space, has spent almost half a century flying and is only about 23 light hours from home. At its speed, reaching Proxima Centauri would take more than 70,000 years. The golden record it carries Beethoven and Blind Willie Johnson. Greetings in dozens of languages. A child's laugh will drift alone for longer than human civilization has existed so far. It is a brave message, but also an admission. We cannot go with it. We can only send a bottle into the ocean and hope. Someone someday finds it. Our radio has done better, but is still bound by light's slow generosity. The earliest strong transmissions, military radar, early television, FDR's speeches have traveled no more than about 100 light-years since leaving Earth. That is a pinprick in the galaxy's span. Even if an advanced civilization were out there and listening with perfect ears, they would have to be within that small sphere to know we exist. Beyond it, we are silent. Not by choice, but by the limit of physics. Meanwhile, the stars we aim for are not standing still. They orbit the galactic center, shifting like slow dancers, so that by the time our signal reaches a place, the place itself may have moved or changed. This scale works as a kind of eraser, not malicious, but unstoppable. Civilizations, we suspect, do not last forever. Our own written history is only 5,000 years deep, our industrial moment barely 2 centuries. Even if we survive our present hazards and build ships capable of true interstellar flight, those journeys will stretch longer than nations or empires usually endure. A starship could leave tomorrow and arrive in some future when its maker's language is forgotten, when their cities are dust and their motives unclear, even to their descendants. Signals work the same way. A call can cross space. But by the time an answer returns, whole cultures can rise and fall, leaving no one able to reply. This is one reason the night sky's silence may not mean loneliness, only misaligned clocks. Imagine a planet that built radios 1,000,000 years ago, broadcast its wonder, and then vanished or turned inward. Their last words might be passing us now as faint static no one notices, or might have crossed our orbit long before we had receivers to listen. We may also be sending out our own one-sided story, Voyager's record. Arecibo's coded pulse to a distant cluster 25,000 light-years away. None of it will see a reply while anything like our current world survives. Time itself stretches the conversation until it dissolves, yet we keep sending. Perhaps because the attempt matters, even if success is beyond reach. Breakthrough Starshot and other concepts dream of wafer-sized craft pushed by lasers to a fraction of light speed. But even then, arrival would take decades and transmission back more decades still. We build better ears, expanding arrays of radio telescopes and new optical searches for alien beacons. Yet we know the odds are long. Each message is an act of hope, but also humility. We are tiny and young, and the ocean we float on is deeper than we can yet swim. The sea of stars erases in other ways too. Radiation, cold, and time destroy ships that drift too long. Bits of memory, data, metals, delicate instruments, decay and cosmic weather. Even if Voyagers reach the void between suns, their signals weaken, their hardware fails. A lost probe could wander for millions of years until it is only dust, carrying no story anyone could read. The same fate might meet ships from elsewhere, perhaps. The galaxy is littered with ghost craft too dead to shine. Sometimes at night it is tempting to feel despair at this scale. To think that if the universe is full of life, we will never touch it, and if it is empty, we will be lonely forever. But the truth might be less absolute and more bittersweet. There could be countless small lights, each bright for a while, each sending whispers that mostly fade before finding a listener. We may be one of them now. Our work, then, is not only to search, but to last. To push against our own briefness so that if another mind is out there, they might still catch a fragment of us, perhaps one day far ahead. When our civilization has had centuries to adapt, we will cross these gulfs not with fragile metal, but with something enduring enough to outlast dynasties and languages. For now, we look up knowing that distance and time are honest, vast, and patient, and that survival itself is an extraordinary achievement. The stars remain beautiful, precisely because they are far. Gold. A cold reminder that to reach another world is to stretch beyond what we have ever managed before. And so we stand at the edge of the sea, sending out our faint signals, hoping someone, somewhere, is also trying to cross the same immeasurable dark in the spring of 1986. A control room in northern Ukraine filled with alarms and disbelief as a reactor. For the Chernobyl nuclear power plant went out of control and exploded, blowing the roof apart and sending a column of radioactive smoke into the night. In the hours that followed, operators tried to make sense of gauges that no longer told the truth, and outside. The town of Pripyat, home to more than 40,000 people, still slept unaware. Buses came at dawn to take them away. They thought they would be gone for a few days, perhaps a week. They never returned. The Ferris wheel in the new amusement park that was supposed to open on May Day still stands, its yellow seats creaking in the wind. And apartments remain filled with forgotten toys, books, and family photographs. What was once a model of Soviet modernity, a place alive with electric lights and television signals, became an instant ghost city. Time has moved strangely there. In the absence of human routine, nature surged forward. Birch trees sprouted through cracked pavement. Wolves and boar roamed the empty avenues. And vines creep up concrete towers designed to stand for centuries, but already stained and crumbling. This return is not romantic. Radiation lingers, and sickness shadows the ground. But it shows how quickly human presence fades when the circuits and schedules behind it stop. The power grid dies, pumps fail, water seeps where it should not, and buildings begin to sag. The once humming electric dream of a planned city turned almost overnight into silence that nature understands well. Chernobyl is only one stark window into a larger truth. Our built world relies on constant attention. The technologies we trust to last, neon, data, steel, glass, require hands and minds to keep them alive. When those vanish, entropy begins its patient work. The same story played out on a smaller scale in places like Detroit, where factories closed and entire neighborhoods were left to weeds and rain, or in Varosha on the island of Cyprus, where an invasion in 1974 froze a bustling resort in time, and the sea now drags away its hotels grain by grain. Even modern skyscrapers and highways, symbols of unstoppable growth, are only temporary without repair. Concrete cracks, rebar rusts, asphalt breaks into patches, and glass facades fog and fall. What we see in these abandoned zones is not just physical ruin, but a quiet end to information itself. Chernobyl's control panels still hold labels and dials, but many are now unreadable, fading under dust and moisture. Paper records stored in government offices molder until they crumble. In Pripyat's school libraries, textbooks lie open, but their pages rot and blur. On our own devices, the decay would be faster. Digital memory without power or migration does not linger. Hard drive seize. Magnetic tape demagnetizes. Servers fail. If caretakers vanish suddenly, our enormous, shimmering archives, everything from literature and film to scientific data, could slip away faster than a stack of papyrus ever did. This is the unspoken fear beneath many modern conversations about collapse. It is not only about war or disaster, but about fragility hiding under apparent strength. The electric world seems permanent while it is fed and maintained, but it can be unmade in a single bad decade. Imagine servers gone cold in windowless rooms, their drives silent. Imagine satellites tumbling with dead batteries. Imagine a skyline without power, its glass towers dark and hollow. Unlike stone temples or pyramids, our proudest creations, data centers, fiber lines, code have no defense once the flow of energy and work stops. Some glimpses of this future can already be found in microcosm. In the years after the fall of the Soviet Union, scientists visiting old secret towns found mainframes and tapes holding research with no one left to read them. Early NASA tapes of the Apollo missions had to be painstakingly recovered because original drives and formats were obsolete. Even now, museums race to preserve early digital art and literature because file formats vanish faster than ancient languages once did. Without steady translation into new machines, today's memory will be unreadable in a century, yet there is something quietly beautiful in the way. Nature receives our collapse. Forests push through cracked streets. Birds nest in quiet factories. Rivers reroute when dams fail. Pripyat is green and alive in ways it never was when children played under controlled lights and tidy hedges. But that same beauty is also warning. Our cities and networks are an experiment in speed and scale, but not in longevity. We have built a civilization of light and signal that depends on constant repair. Take away the hands, and within decades, the jungle, or its local equivalent of rust, fungus, and water will begin its patient rewrite. If future archaeologists arrive long after us, they might find strange relics. A sealed vault of backup tapes, but no way to decode them. Brittle circuit boards fused with dust. Shattered solar panels among weeds. Road signs in languages no one speaks. Our skyscrapers might last longer than our data, but not forever. Glass will fall, steel will twist, and towers will become steep hills of rubble. The fragments that endure may be simpler. A gold record bolted to Voyager drifting through the dark. Or deep archives buried under salt and rock. If anyone remembers to build them strong, thinking about this fragility can be frightening, yet it also focuses the mind. Unlike those before us, we know how quickly information can die and how dependent our lives are on invisible threads of power and upkeep. That knowledge is a chance to build more wisely, to print and carve as well as stream and upload, to store in places beyond immediate reach of fire or flood, to teach so that memory can live in people as well as machines. The ruins of our time do not have to be empty silence, but still the image returns, an abandoned city under green vines. Servers hushed, signs rusting, the night sky bright above a world once filled with light. Dust settling over electric dreams is not just poetry, it is the natural course when noise stops. As with Chernobyl, the world will not mourn us for long. It will fill our spaces, climb our stairs, and sing its own songs until someone else, if there is anyone else, comes wandering and wonders who we were. Every human being carries a record older than any library, written not in ink, but in the long coiled threads of DNA. It is quiet and unseen, yet it holds journeys and meetings that happen long before memory or myth, a map of where our ancestors walked and whom they met on the way. Unlike stone or paper, this archive is alive. It is copied and carried every time one life gives rise to another, and so it endures even when names and cities vanish. What archaeology struggles to preserve with broken pottery and scattered bones? Genetics sometimes recovers with a single drop of blood or a cell taken from the inside of a cheek. In the last few decades, this quiet code has begun to speak with clarity. Projects like the Human Genome Diversity Project and later work by geneticists such as Svante Pubo and David Reich have compared sequences from people across the globe, charting patterns that echo ancient migrations. From this work, we know that nearly everyone outside Africa carries small but measurable traces of Neanderthal DNA, a legacy of encounters tens of thousands of years ago when Homo sapiens leaving Africa met and mixed with those older humans in Europe and Western Asia, and some populations of Oceania. Up to 5% of the genome comes from Denisovans, another mysterious cousin species, known first only from a finger bone and a single tooth found in Siberia's Denisova cave in 2008. These discoveries were astonishing because they showed that whole branches of humanity once lost and unknown still live inside our cells even after their cultures and bodies disappeared. The same methods reveal movements our ancestors never recorded. Long before there were written chronicles, small groups left Africa, splitting and merging as they followed game and coastlines, leaving genetic trails across the Arabian Peninsula, into India and further east toward Australia. Later, waves of farmers moved from the Fertile Crescent into Europe, bringing crops and cattle. Their DNA still flows strongly in the blood of modern Europeans, mingled with older hunter-gatherer lines. In the Americas, studies of ancient remains like the Anzac Child in Montana, buried about 12,600 years ago, have connected present-day indigenous groups to the first migrations across Beringia. The Novanished land bridge that once joined Siberia to Alaska, even when villages are gone and languages have shifted, the deep record remains intact and bodies living now. These revelations often reshape what we thought we knew. For centuries, myths and later nationalist stories tried to draw straight, clean lines of descent. Yet the genome shows constant meeting, mixing, and adaptation. Each war, migration, marriage, or shared meal between strangers left a molecular echo. Forgotten tribes that left no monuments can still be traced because their genes found refuge in new families. Even the great collapses we read about, cities falling, cultures fading, do not mean total erasure. Some children survived, moved, and carried forward pieces of the past silently. The work also lets us glimpse single vanished individuals. At El Sidran Cave in Spain, Neanderthal remains yielded sequences that identified family ties, a father, a child, siblings, their lineage cut short, yet not fully gone. Since some of their DNA survives in millions of us today. In Europe, the genome of CI, the Copper Age man found in an alpine glacier in 1991, has connected him to living populations in Corsica and Sardinia, showing that his people did not die, but blended and wandered south. In Africa, ancient genomes from Malawi and Tanzania have revealed networks of movement and exchange among hunter-gatherer groups over thousands of years, rewriting ideas about isolation and continuity on that continent. This biological archive is not infallible. It cannot tell us stories in detail, cannot name villages, or explain beliefs. But it does something profound. It defeats total forgetting. Where fire and conquest can burn libraries and topple statues, the human body itself preserves a record. Each person alive is a living time capsule, carrying quiet signatures of love, struggle, survival, and adaptation stretching back hundreds of generations. The resilience is breathtaking. It also reshapes how we think about identity. When commercial tests first told people they carried small percentages of ancestry from unexpected regions, there was surprise, sometimes discomfort, but also wonder. The genome shows that we are not neat lines, but braided rivers. Our present selves are mosaics of forgotten journeys, proof that the human story is larger and more entangled than any single flag or language, in a way. DNA is the answer to the fear that all might be lost. Civilizations fall, maps fade, and even memory in its most careful form, books, stone, digital records, can vanish. Yet we survive each other. Conquered peoples, refugees, wanderers, and traders do not disappear entirely. They become someone's great-great-grandparent and remain in the code of grandchildren who may know nothing of the ancient names. This is survival beyond archive and monument, deep and quiet endurance. Scientists speak of ghost populations, groups known only from genetic signals with no clear archaeological trace. These ghosts prove that you do not need walls or temples to reach forward in time. To live, to have children, was enough to leap the centuries and still whisper to the present. They are invisible witnesses of forgotten migrations. Standing behind our faces, there is something comforting in this, when set against all the lost worlds. We have walked through and thought, Uruk under sand, Pompeii under ash, cities drowned by rising seas, libraries gone to flame. Those who lived there are not fully gone if we walk here now. Their resilience, their small everyday victories, survive at the deepest level of what we are. Perhaps one day, far in the future, if our own cities vanish and our machines fail, someone will still carry a thread of us, an echo of our adaptations and loves. They may not know our languages or stories, but they will be our continuation just the same. Against the vast silence of time and the fragility of memory, DNA is a quiet defiance, a way for the past to persist uninvited and unplanned. Woven into the bodies of the living and refusing, in its wordless way, to be forgotten. The desert looks empty when you first step onto it. A horizon of pale gold and broken light, but it is anything but simple. Beneath the shifting skin of sand, there are traces of journeys and lives that once threaded its silence. The Taklamakan in western China, called by some the Sea of Death, and the immense Sahara stretching across North Africa, both hold within them layers of history that no map can fully catch. They seem barren because they have learned to hide. Yet sometimes the wind changes, a dune moves, and what was buried long ago stands blinking in the sun again. The Taklamakan was once not a barrier, but a busy highway of the Silk Road. Around 2,000 years ago, caravans loaded with silk, jade and spices traced a fragile path along its rim and even across its interior. Stopping at oasis towns like Nia Lulen and Meran, these were places alive with markets and temples, with canals and fruit trees. Their people literate and linked by trade to Rome, India, and China. But the desert is patient and merciless. Rivers feeding these oases shifted or dried. Climate cooled and winds grew harsher. By the 4th century, many settlements were failing. Lulan, once a wealthy kingdom with its own rulers and coinage, fell silent, its canals clogged, its walls left to sand and wind. For centuries, no one knew exactly where Lulan had been. Travelers told of ruins that appeared and vanished again beneath storms. In 1900, the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin reached the buried city after a long and dangerous trek. He found timber houses collapsed but still standing in part, with roof beams and ancient Chinese documents on wood slips lying where they had fallen. Shoes, tools, and even foodstuffs were discovered, dry and almost preserved by the desert's thirst. Later, other expeditions uncovered Buddhist stupas and fragile paintings still bright after a millennium in darkness. The sand that killed these towns had also kept them from rotting away. The Sahara, so wide it seems infinite, has performed the same double work. It was not always as we know it. Thousands of years ago, it was green, scattered with lakes and grasslands. Early humans painted giraffes and hippos on rock walls at Tazili Najjar in Algeria, because those animals roamed where now there is only dust. As the climate dried, great trade routes arose along its few dependable oases. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Chinguetti thrived as nodes for salt, gold, books, and scholars. Others, less lucky or less well-watered, vanished under the advancing dunes. Sometimes these lost places return unexpectedly. In 2011, after strong winds in Egypt's western desert, locals reported strange shapes appearing. Archaeologists later identified long-buried Roman forts and caravan stops. In Niger and Mali, satellite imagery combined with fieldwork has revealed traces of ancient river channels and settlements hidden for centuries. In the Fezzan region of Libya, Garamantian cities, once the heart of a forgotten Saharan civilization skilled in underground irrigation, came to light again when explorers found walls and burial mounds half revealed by sandstorms. The Garamantes built fogaras, tunnels that carried water for miles beneath dunes. Without maintenance, the channels collapsed and their fields died, leaving whole communities to fade into myth until rediscovered in the 20th century. What emerges from these stories is a strange rhythm of concealment and revelation. The desert destroys quickly. One bad season, a river gone astray, and trade routes collapse. Yet in doing so, it can also freeze a moment, drying and sealing away artifacts that damp climates would erase. Textiles, papyrus, wooden beams. Even food and human remains have been found astonishingly intact after centuries because there is no moisture to rot them. When wind cuts into a dune, it can open a window to a time that thought, self-forgotten. The fragility of human effort is everywhere in these remains. An abandoned sandal lying where its owner set it down 1,500 years ago, a clay jar with silk threads still caught in its mouth, a painted prayer flag curled but not decayed. Each speaks of a life interrupted. No invader needed to burn these cities. The slow turn of climate and the caprice of water were enough. And once people leave, the sand comes fast. Canals fill, roads vanish, and only a faint rise or scatter of pottery hints at the busy noise that once lived there. Yet there is also resilience. The same sands that swallowed Lulun guarded its wooden documents, so that we can still read tax lists and family letters from a vanished kingdom. The dryness that ended the Garamantes' crops also kept their irrigation tunnels recognizable and their tombs unspoiled. Even in the empty heart of the Sahara, rock art has lasted thousands of years, telling of hippos where no hippo could now survive. The desert does not care what it saves and what it erases. It simply holds until chance or curiosity disturbs it. Modern tools make the uncovering swifter. Satellite sensors can detect buried walls or roads by subtle changes in soil color or texture. Ground-penetrating radar can peer beneath dunes without digging. In China's Tarim Basin, these methods have found more lost towns and even ancient cemeteries with mummies. Dried to parchment but still wearing felt hats and wool robes from Bronze Age cultures once thought isolated. Each find rewrites some part of the human map, adding forgotten chapters about movement, trade, and adaptation. Still, the desert teaches humility. It reminds us that cities and roads are only temporary guests in a landscape ruled by wind and time. We might imagine permanence when we build, but climate is larger than intention. The caravan bells once heard across these sands are gone. The towers and gardens of lost oases feed, trees or lie flattened. And yet, because of the desert's peculiar mercy, we can still find voices from that silence. A letter to a governor in Lulun. A child's toy buried near a Garamantian, well, a painted antelope on stone where grass has not grown for 5,000 years, to walk among those half-exposed. Ruins is to feel both wonder and warning. Wonder, because across so many centuries, something still waits to tell us that humans passed this way and dreamed, enough to build cities in a place so harsh. Warning, because the same forces that took them, shifting climate, failing water, lost roots, are still at work. The deserts remember without pity and without hurry. They will one day take new roads and new towers, holding them until some future seeker digs and marvels at what we once dared to do. Beneath this vast and patient sky, There are moments in history when a people seems to step suddenly out of obscurity into light, building with daring and skill, shaping trade and art so original it still startles us thousands of years later. And then, just as quickly, they go silent. We walk their ruins today and wonder how something so sure of itself could fade almost without warning. The pattern is older than our own stories, and sobering. For any who think progress alone guarantees survival, in the lowlands of southern Mexico and the Gulf Coast, the Olmecs flourished between about 1500 and 400 BCE. They carved colossal basalt heads, some taller than a man and weighing many tons. With faces that are at once stern and alive, they built ceremonial centers like San Lorenzo and La Venta, with plazas and pyramids long before the Maya or Aztec rose. There is evidence of early writing, long-distance trade in jade and obsidian, its complex religious symbols, the jaguar, the feathered serpent that later civilizations borrowed. For centuries, they were a cultural heartbeat of Mesoamerica, shaping what came after them. Yet their cities emptied. By 350 BCE, La Venta was abandoned. Scholars speak of shifting rivers, exhausted soils, and possibly political upheaval. Whatever the exact blend, the brilliance of the Olmecs did not shield them from nature's quiet power and the fragility of human networks, far away and earlier still. Along the Indus River and its tributaries in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, another grand civilization rose around 2600 BCE, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, were cities with carefully planned streets laid in grids, advanced drainage and sewage systems that would not be matched in much of the world until modern times, standardized weights and measures for trade, and a writing system still undeciphered. They traded with Mesopotamia, sending carnelian beads and cotton cloth, and imported lapis lazuli and silver. At their height, the Indus cities may have supported hundreds of thousands, an extraordinary achievement for their age. Yet by 1900 BCE, decline had begun. Climate appears to have shifted. The Saraswati and Gagarhaka rivers shrank or changed course. Trade with Mesopotamia faltered as Sumer and Akkad themselves fell to new powers. Without their lifelines of water and commerce, the great cities thinned out. Houses were abandoned, and the script fell silent. People did not vanish. Descendants moved and lived on. But the urban experiment ended, leaving baked brick mounds to bake further in the sun to the west. In the dry canyons and red deserts of what is now Jordan and northwestern Arabia, the Nabateans built a kingdom out of stone and sand. Starting as nomads, by the 4th century BCE, they controlled caravan routes that carried frankincense, myrrh, spices, and silk from Arabia and India to the Mediterranean. Their capital, Petra, cut directly into rose-red cliffs, astonishes visitors even today. Its facades blend Greek columns with local design, and its water channels and cisterns reveal brilliant engineering in an arid land. For a time, their control of desert trade brought wealth and influence so strong that Rome respected and later absorbed them rather than destroy them outright. Yet Petra too emptied. When new sea routes around Arabia weakened caravan traffic and Rome shifted its power, the Nabatean economy withered. Earthquakes in the 4th century damaged the city further. By the 7th century, Petra was largely forgotten outside local memory, and dunes and silence took hold. These stories repeat because they rest on the same simple truth, no matter how clever or inventive. A civilization is only as stable as the ground and climate and connections it depends on. The Olmecs thrived where rivers fed fields and carried trade. But when those rivers shifted course, their centers could not survive. The Indus cities built on monsoon rhythms. When rains faltered and rivers wandered, their carefully measured bricks were no defense. The Nabateans mastered water and desert stone, but could not control the oceans that suddenly stole their caravans' customers. Brilliance is real. These were societies of engineers, traders, astronomers, and artists, but brilliance alone cannot hold against environmental change and the slow rearranging of trade and power. What is haunting is how little time is needed for the light to dim. A few centuries, a handful of human lifetimes, and what once seemed eternal becomes shards and half-remembered names. Even written language, if not shared widely, can die before anyone can save it. The Olmec script is debated, but unreadable. The Indus script may hold entire libraries of thought, but is mute to us. Nabatean inscriptions survive. Their living culture ended with Rome's embrace and Islam's rise. Modern eyes often look at these ruins with a mixture of awe and quiet fear. Our own networks feel global and unbreakable, yet they too depend on delicate roots of energy, climate, and trade. What would happen if seas rose or rainfall shifted as it did for the Harappans? If commerce collapsed like the caravans? If political tides turned inward as they did in China and Japan? We imagine that knowledge and connectivity will save us, but the same was surely thought by builders of straight drains in Mohenjo-daro and the water masters of Petra. Yet there is also something tender in these lost sparks. They remind us that human creativity blooms even in brief windows. A carved head staring from the forest floor, a street still aligned to vanished stars, a stairway down into a Petra cistern dry for 1,000 years. These are not only warnings but proof that people, given time and need, will build beauty and order from almost nothing. Their light, though short, still reaches us. Perhaps endurance is not always measured in unbroken cities, but in the way influence travels. Olmec symbols fed Maya and Aztec imagination. The Indus passed crafts and crops outward. Nabatean knowledge of desert water fed later Arab engineering. Even collapse does not erase all. It only changes form. But the fragility of any single moment remains. We rise, we connect, we build, and we imagine the glow permanent. Yet, history's quiet. Lesson is that the spark is precious precisely because it can go out, to stand among these ruins. Today is to feel both small and linked. Their builders lived as surely as we do, loved and planned and hoped their work would last, but the winds and markets had other ideas. Still, by finding and studying their remains, we keep the spark alive in another way, telling their story so that what was brilliant for a time may not vanish entirely into the long night. On clear nights, the sky looks close enough to touch, but distance lives behind every small bright point. Even so, we keep building better ways to look and to listen, as if our eyes and machines could slowly push back the dark. In deserts and mountaintops, we raise telescopes that dwarf cathedrals. Their mirrors polished so perfectly they can drink the faint light of galaxies that burned when our world was still molten. We park rovers on other planets, letting them wander far from us, but always within reach of a thin radio thread. We lift antennas wide as lakes toward the quiet, hoping to catch something, a pulse, a pattern, sign that the silence is not empty, but only waiting. The search has gone on for generations. In 1960, at Green Bank in West Virginia, Frank Drake aimed a radio telescope toward the stars Tau Ceti and Epsilon Eridani, beginning what would become SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. His simple project Ozma listened for weeks and heard nothing certain, but it opened a door. Since then, we have scanned thousands of stars, sweeping across frequencies we think might carry an intentional signal. The Arecibo Observatory in Puerto Rico, before its great dish collapsed in 2020, sent a focused message toward the globular cluster. M13 in 1974, a binary postcard about who we are, where we live, and what our bodies are made of. The Very Large Array in New Mexico, the Allen Telescope Array in California. And new instruments like China's Fast Dish continue the work, pouring data into servers in hopes of catching a whisper. Meanwhile, our mechanical explorers have slipped the leash of Earth and gone outward, each a small ambassador. Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 launched in 1977. Carry gold records etched with music, greetings, and pictures of life here. Pioneer 10 and 11 before them bore plaques showing a man and woman, a map of pulsars, and our position relative to the galaxy. New Horizons sailed past Pluto and keeps flying toward deeper cold. None of these crafts are fast enough to reach another star within any time we can imagine. But still we send them, messages cast into a sea we barely understand. And yet, for all this effort, the great silence remains. We have not caught an unambiguous call. No engineered beacon sweeping our receivers. No clear signature of alien craft among the stars. We have seen possible hints, the famous WOW signal in 1977, a burst of radio from Sagittarius that never repeated, unexplained flashes in narrowband, anomalies that later proved natural or slipped into noise, but nothing that holds up under long study. Each time hope flares, analysis dims it again. The universe answers with quiet. That quiet can weigh heavily. Some hear in it a verdict, the echo of the Fermi question, where is everyone? Perhaps we are alone, or perhaps civilizations are rare and brief, their lights going out before we can see them. Perhaps the physics of distance and time really do keep voices apart, turning every attempt to reach across the gulf into a one-way prayer. There is a loneliness to this thought, especially when we have filled our own skies with machines and signals, and still met no reply. But silence is not proof of emptiness. It may only mean we are early listeners, not yet skilled enough or patient enough. Our instruments hear on narrow bands? We have surveyed a fraction of stars, and for a heartbeat of cosmic time. The galaxy is wide, and the possibilities of technology stranger than we can guess. We may be searching for radio while someone else long ago moved to light or neutrinos or something beyond our physics. Or perhaps the others do listen, but choose caution. Knowing the dangers of being found before knowing the finder, there is also something quiet and wonderful about the search itself. Even without answers, to point a dish into dark space and hope is an act of faith and connection. Each signal we send is a small promise to survive, to keep curiosity alive. The rovers on Mars send back pictures of dusty plains and thin blue sunsets. The Webb Space Telescope shows galaxies forming when the first stars were new. These things alone are victories. They say that a species once bound to one small planet learned to lift its gaze and ask, who else might be out there? And there is time still. The stars around us will keep burning for billions of years. Our work has only begun. We can imagine descendants building faster ships, quieter and stronger archives, wider ways of listening. We can imagine some distant night when another world's message finally threads the void to reach whoever we have become. Survival is the first step toward meeting. Curiosity is the second. So we keep looking up, aware of all the vanished worlds behind us, all the sparks we have tried to trace through ruins. Sand and deep sea, aware too of our own fragility. The quiet does not have to mean despair. It can also mean room to grow, a vast space still unwritten. Under that sky, a single watcher with a telescope, a child with a radio, a probe crossing the edge of the heliosphere, all are acts of wonder. We have learned how much can be lost. We have also learned how fiercely memory tries to live. Perhaps the silence is simply waiting for patience. For us to endure long enough to join whatever survivors are left. Until then, every night spent searching is its own kind of meeting, a conversation with possibility. The dark stays wide and unknowable, but not empty. Not yet. We look up, still alone for now, but with a hope that has outlasted every fall before and may yet carry us far enough to hear another voice call back.